Alright, let's get in. Now that I got something to sync the audio between this camera and this camera, let's talk about some gear. More specifically, what I got in my camera bag, because there's a lot. This is a photography-based YouTube channel, so it's pretty much expected that I've got a fair bit of kit. My primary camera is, of course, the one I'm using right now, Sony A7R Mark III. This thing has been my workhorse ever since I got it. It's been an absolute dream. The one issue I have with this camera really is the fact that I can't map the white balance as Kelvin units to a dial. That is the one thing that I wish I could do, and honestly it wouldn't be that hard to mod into the firmware, but I'm not gonna risk that just yet. The only other issue I've had with this camera, and this is due to my own stupidity, I was using a cheap microphone cable and it broke off inside the camera, which now unfortunately forces me to record audio using a second camera. Which, the second camera happens to be my RX0 Mark II. This camera is often mistaken for a GoPro, but I assure you it's far more capable, and unfortunately for me, far more expensive. This is actually my second RX0, because I actually lost my first one to Alice Lake. I was paddleboarding, long story short, that camera's stuck at the bottom of the lake. Feel free to try and find it. This little beast is packing a 1-inch sensor and a 24mm f4 Zeiss lens on it. That ain't no GoPro. Well, it is about the same size and carries the same waterproofing and drop resistant features that you would find on a typical GoPro. It does have a couple of advantages. The most obvious one would be that flip screen, which has been incredibly useful, believe it or not. And I've actually shot a couple of vlogs with this. So the biggest thing for me with this camera is its I/O. As compared to something like a GoPro where you would require an adapter off of a single USB port, the RX0 has a full set of I/O, including USB, HDMI, and audio inputs, allowing me to record proper audio given the dead mic jack on my A7R. Speaking of audio, let's take a closer look at that. Typically I'll record audio straight into camera, whether that be the RX0 or this A6600 that I recently purchased. But getting back into the audio, my main microphone of choice is the Sennheiser MKE400. It's a lot smaller than something like a Rode VideoMic Pro, and actually suits my voice a little bit better, as I've had a lot of issues with the Rode microphones doing some weirdness to the low frequencies, as my voice technically classifies as a double bass, which for some weird reason the Rode microphones have an issue with. I've had the same issue with my Zoom H4n Pro, which can sometimes muddle the low-end frequencies and just drop out the highs entirely, whereas the Sennheiser microphones have a little bit more high-end sparkle and naturally represent the low end, while also maintaining a small footprint and very strong background noise suppression. Now back to that A6600 I mentioned a moment ago. I bought this little guy for vlogging, and I've definitely been using it for that, but in most scenarios the RX0 does a great job. I have found this camera incredibly useful for doing gimbal work though, which is a nice segue into that. The current gimbal I use, albeit infrequently, is the Moza Air 2, and when it works great. However, I have had issues with it when trying to bring it on trips. Because it doesn't lock down all axes when you're packing it, it can be a little difficult to bring around, which is why recently I've been looking more towards something like a Zhiyun crane. However, since it's something I don't use that often, I don't think it's really worth the upgrade. As far as equipment that I do use, tripods. My current go-to is the Benro AERO 7. This is the AERO 7, right? Yeah, my current go-to tripod is the Benro AERO 7, combined with an S7 fluid head. There is a carbon fiber version of this tripod, which would be quite nice for when I'm doing long hiking trips or camping trips. One of my favorite features about this tripod is that I can actually remove one of the legs and use it as a monopod and maintain the fluid head. The feet on it are replaceable, and it comes with 2 sets in the box. It's both rubber tipped and spike feet. And trust me, I've used a lot of really cheap tripods in the past, including this monstrosity, which is what I first started recording videos with. We'll just gloss past that time. Save yourself a lot of headache, get a decent tripod. You don't have to go with something like this AERO 7. If you're looking for something a little cheaper, I would probably check out something like the AERO 2 or something like the Manfrotto B-Free. Something that is almost always fixed to my tripod is my Karman carbon fiber slider. This is one of the cheapest sliders on the market that has a flywheel, which is an incredibly useful feature. and the biggest reason that slider shots actually look any good. Because without any kind of counterweight or counterbalancing system, you're just pushing it across the surface. All the slider's going to do is make sure that that's a straight line. However, if you have a slider with a flywheel, it makes a huge difference, because now you have the ability to easily ease in and out of your shots. And this camera or slider definitely gets the job done. Alright, let's check in on media. Primarily I'll use these SanDisk Extreme Pro cards for all of my photo work. But for most of the video stuff, I use Lexars. That's generally what I'll do, but that's because most of the time I'm filming on the A7R, which has dual card slots, allowing me to split photo and video onto separate cards. Whereas with cameras like the RX0 and A6600 only having one card slot, those will typically record to SanDisk Extreme cards. Have we talked about power yet? Although I do have original Sony batteries that came with these cameras, except for the RX0, which, again, long story, I primarily use DSTE batteries. They're a third-party battery supplier, but in my opinion, they give you about 80% of the performance for about 20% of the cost. I mean, seriously, who the hell's paying 90 bucks for batteries? I don't use a whole lot of artificial lights that I bring on myself. Typically, I look for lights in a scene, whether that be the sun, or fire, or neon signs, because y'all know I love my neon signs. I do typically carry around a couple of lights with me, and my favorite is actually a Yongnuo 360, which is actually the light I'm using to light up the background. And this thing is full RGB and is powered off Sony NP-F style batteries, which is incredibly useful. Although this is the first generation model, which I intentionally purchased over the second gen, because the second gen uses an internal battery that has to be charged over USB, whereas the first generation uses those Sony NP-F style batteries, which is what I personally prefer. Alright, I'll stop teasing you guys. Let's dig into the meat. The lenses. Now this may come as a surprise to some people, and not to anyone that really knows me in the photo space. I don't actually own a single native lens for Sony, even though I have 3 Sony cameras at this point. Not a single native lens. I am all about that vintage glass, and I primarily, excuse the pun, shoot primes. And I've amassed quite a large collection over the years, and quite a lot of different lenses from different manufacturers and different brands. But my favorites by far are the Pentax Super Takumars. These lenses were made from around the mid-60s to early 70s, and they are by far my favorites. In fact, you're currently looking at me through a 50mm f1.4. Granted, we're stopped down to about f4, and I am using a focal reducer to make this an equivalent 35mm full-frame shot, but hey, still classic glass. And the 2 lenses that I typically have glued to my 6600 are my 17mm f4 and this guy, the Canon 50mm f1.4. This is actually an FD mount lens, making it very odd. It's a weird system and I don't entirely understand it, but it seemed to work. Until they jumped over to the EF mount, and now we're jumping ship from that to RF. Though I do have a few zoom lenses in my kit, it's almost always primes. The set I typically carry in my bag includes the Super Takumar 17mm f4, the 28mm f3.5, 50mm f1.4, 85mm f1.9, 135mm f2.5, and the 200mm f4. This is typically the kit I'll carry with me in my bag alongside a focal reducer that attaches to the front of the lens and a full set of adapters for both cameras, which would be Pentax K-mount, M42 mount for the typical set of Takumars that I carry, as well as a Canon FD mount, and if necessary, Tamron Adaptol, which I have used Tamron Adaptol lenses in the past, adapted to Canon FD, and then attached to the cameras. Clip 2 of A-roll, because I've been shooting for over half an hour. 30-minute record limit. Not something I'd ever thought I would have to actually deal with as a problem, but we're YouTubers, and these are problems we deal with. Now what was I talking about? Prime lenses. Typically, I'll carry around a full set of vintage Takumars, and 2 additional pieces of kit. 1 additional lens of choice, which is typically the Canon 50mm f1.4, although on occasion I have carried around Pentax M series lenses including the 50mm f1.4 and the 80-200 f4. Although I do have a couple of very unique lenses that I don't bring out very often, including this Rokinon 500mm mirror lens. Even though it's kind of an odd duck lens, it's definitely a lot easier to use than this beast, and a lot lighter as well. Because even though these prime lenses that I usually carry with me are fairly small, and relatively sharp considering their age, they are heavy, because these beasts are made out of metal. No plastic here. I mean, hell, even this tiny little 28mm, it weighs a ton. Nextly, I wish I had a true 35mm, like the Takumar 35 f2 that I've been hunting down for a while. Unfortunately, I haven't found one locally in good condition, so we're stuck with this for now, which, well, janky, kind of works. Typically, you'll find me shooting on a 50mm or a 28mm, because I'm actually not a huge fan of the 24mm look, and significantly prefer that of a 28. And in my personal opinion, if you feel like you need something wider than a 28mm, go all in on something like an 18mm, or if you're feeling real fancy, go for something like a 9mm. Another really important thing is the vibe on set. So typically I carry around a Bluetooth speaker. The particular one that I carry around is the UE Boom 2, which, if my memory serves, just after I bought this, Ultimate Ears was acquired by Logitech. The more you know. One last thing I typically carry in my camera bag, a laptop. My machine of choice is the Gigabyte AERO 15X. This particular one is a couple years old now, and I have replaced the main storage drive, as I managed to kill the first one. But I ended up with a slight upgrade anyway, with an Intel 660p 1TB. This machine is packing a 6-core 12-thread CPU, 16 gigs of RAM, a GTX 1070 Max-Q, and a 94.24 watt-hour battery. One of the biggest batteries you're legally allowed to take on a plane. And an added cherry on top is the display. Not only is it a 1080p 120Hz refresh rate panel, it's actually Pantone X-Rite color calibrated and certified. I'll also typically carry around a pair of headphones, as editing with laptop speakers, no one wants to do that. And usually that'll be my Sennheiser PXE 550s, or when I'm sitting here in the studio editing, I've got a pair of HD 598s. Oh, and one more thing that I usually have on my camera bag is the Peak Design capture clip. Now, even though it's expensive, and when I first got mine I thought it was a little ridiculous, I now have two of them. Even though they're a bit pricey, they're by far one of the most used and most useful pieces of equipment in my kit, alongside the legendary Peak Design camera strap clips. And I think that's just about it. This is all equipment that I've amassed over several years of doing this. But take a look at this photo. No, this wasn't taken with my A7Riii or A6600, not even something like an iPhone 10. This was taken with my Samsung Galaxy S3, a phone that was released in 2012. And if I can get photos like that with a phone from 2012, it's not about the gear. It's about how you think and how you do. Yes, the nice expensive gear makes it a lot easier, but as the saying goes, a poor workman blames his tools. The reasoning behind that is that a good workman knows his tools. And it's all about learning the equipment you have and working to its advantage and its disadvantages. Back when I was taking photos with that phone in 2012, because it's a phone with a fairly small sensor and fairly deep depth of field because of it, I found it to be well suited for macro photography. And I tried to play into that as best I could. Alright, I think that's it for this video. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace!